Hey class, so last lesson we talked about naval disarmament, and that pretty much rounds up a lot of the whole post-World War One peacekeeping and peacemaking efforts that the League of Nations tried to make. Moving on, we are going to look at a couple of the tests that the League of Nations went under. We talked before we talked about Vilna, Corfu, a little bit in the previous lessons in class, but this lesson we're going to talk about a major one, which is Manchuria. The next one we're going to look at is Abyssinia, but this class we're going to focus on Manchuria. And Manchuria, the location, if you look at the map, is northwest of Korea. And it is within striking distance of Japan. And so the Manchurian Crisis essentially has to do with Japan and Manchuria and international relations with the League of Nations. We're going to be looking at Japan right after World War One and why Japan invaded Manchuria. We're going to look at the invasion itself, and we're going to look at the reactions and how the League dealt with it, and also some of the political cartoons that came as a result of this. So that's what we're going to be covering today. Now, Japan after 1919, it was nationalist, because they felt there was a very strong. Oh, that's a grief. That's the next one, but that's the third one. So the nationalists, it was coined. They coined the slogan "Asia for the Asians," and this statement was made as early as 1904, 1905. But by 1919, it was a very popular statement. There was a whole idea that Asia should be ruled by Asians was popular amongst the Japanese. Japan was a dictatorship where the Japanese emperor was all powerful, and if it wasn't the Japanese emperor, it was the top. It was the top group of people within the Japanese government that really called all the shots. And later on, you'll realize, particularly the military had a lot of power. Japan was aggrieved at that time, since Japan was an ally of Britain during World War One. They got very little out of the peace settlements, and they were very dissatisfied with it. Also, they with the Washington Naval Agreement in 1922, they allowed Japan was allowed to have three ships to Britain's five, and but Japan believed that they should be on parity, or a lot of Japanese felt they should be on par, or maybe not as big of a ratio as 3 to 5, right? And so many Japanese believed it was time to even the score. Also, the army was was very strong. Japan has a very strong military tradition, and you can go all the way back to its samurai culture, and where the samurai in the Tokugawa and during the Tokugawa era of Japan really was the top class of the Japanese social hierarchy, and this and by World War One, after the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class was gone, but all the previous samurais were basically transmutated into the modern military class and the military top of Japan, and so they had a very rich military tradition. Also, there was a Great Depression in the 1920s and 1930s. The Silk Trade collapsed. Thousands of peasants were impoverished. The army solution was very similar to Hitler's Lebensraum policy in Europe, which was to get land for the peasants. And this land, where are they going to get it from? Of course, you get it from your biggest neighbor, China. And also, there was also Japan at that time was very anti-communist, and Japan saw Manchuria as a buffer against communist Russia, and so and so they felt that if you had Manchuria kind of as a buffer to stand between Russia and Japan would not be at risk of communism, and so having Manchuria was more or less essential to their needs. What other needs did Japan have? Well, internally, Japan had a growing population. It had an exploding population. It was overcrowded in the urban areas. There was a there were many people were unequally treated. There was a poor distribution of raw materials. Um, um, there was a sorry. There was a poor distribution of raw materials. Japan did not feel like they were granted territories that they were owed by the Treaty of Versailles, and they were also very unhappy with the racial equality in the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles, yes, it did give Japan the Shandong province in China, but with the Washington Conference, Japan actually had to give that land back to China, and so they felt they were unfairly treated, particularly because they were an ally and they played a major role in defeating the Germans in China during World War One. Japan also had a military government, but because of the Great Depression, a lot of the Japanese military funds were cut, and of course they were not happy about it, and and um, and so that was one of the major problems that they were disgruntled about. We need the military needs to assert themselves once again. That's what they felt. In addition to the fact that a lot of the civil government positions were actually taken over by military officers during that time. Remember, like I said before, according to the traditional hierarchy of Japan, the samurai class is at the top. So if the samurai don't make it into a military government position, well, they had the wealth and the ability to get into the civil government positions as well. There was also a Pan-Asian mission where the Japanese felt they were the superior race of Asia, if not of the world, and and they believed they were the leader of Asia, and there was not to be any more white imperialism in Asia. They felt pretty much like it was their mission to protect Asia from the West, and that includes protecting, and I'm saying this, with quote unquote, Korea, protecting China, protecting any Asians from the West, and protecting means taking over. So why did Japan invade Manchuria at that time, between 1931 and 1933? Well, first off, China was weak. The nationalist government of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was weak, corrupt, and they were also busy fighting the communists internally. And so, when Japan decided to attack Manchuria, really China had no ability to resist. And uh, Manchuria, how should I say it? Historically, is because of the Qing dynasty, and the Qing dynasty was a Manchurian dynasty where the Manchurians came in and took over China just like the Mongolians did. Manchuria was technically part of China, and because the government was Manchurian. Now, Manchuria was also off limits to the Chinese, though, because there was a superiority and inferiority relationship between the Manchurians and the ethnic Chinese. So, Manchurians are allowed to enter China, but Chinese were not allowed to enter Manchuria. This relationship continued until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, and so Manchuria, at this time, is technically part of China, but mostly populated by Manchurians. The Chinese were not allowed to move there. So that's why we're calling this territory Manchuria and not China. But it is also technically a territory of China. And so the invasion of Manchuria had everything to do with a weak China. Number two, the Great Depression. The Great Depression led Japan to want to build an empire to secure the supplies of raw materials. And if you look at the geography of Korea and Manchuria, a lot of the Japanese interests, as I stated earlier in our previous lessons, a lot of the Japanese interests in the northeastern China or northeastern Asia, northeastern Asia, is in the area of Siberia, Manchuria, and Korea, because those areas are rich with resources, and particularly in Manchuria, there's a lot of coal and iron mines. And the Chinese, not the Chinese, the Japanese built the railway called Mantetsu, or Mantetsu, which stands for Manchurian Railway, or Manchurian iron, and that basically is a railway that goes from Busan all the way up to Manchuria. Because of the Great Depression, the Japanese needed secure supplies, and they felt that Manchuria was a good place to take over. Um, in addition, due to the Great Depression, the silk trade collapsed in Japan nearly 40, and it dropped nearly 40% from 1929 to 1930. So in a matter of a year, your almost half of your silk trade is gone, and that created a big problem economically, and for Japan, and so they felt the need to kind of revitalize its economy. The Japanese was also led by military governments, so they pretty much could do whatever they want. The civil government, the civil officers really didn't have much of a say, and if they did say anything, they'd get shot. And we'll be looking at the whole issue of Japanese imperialism and militarism later on in another in the World War II lessons. Uh, Also, who rules Manchuria was one of the main questions. Chinese, technically, like I said earlier, were supposed to rule Manchuria, but the Japanese army ran the railway there, which is Mount Tetsu, which I mentioned earlier, and they also ruled Korea. The Japanese ruled Korea. So once again, who should have jurisdiction of Manchuria? The Chinese technically owned the territory, but the Japanese owned a railroad that goes straight through the heart of Manchuria. And of course, it would be to the Japanese interest to rule Manchuria. This whole takeover of the Manchurian Crisis began with the Mukden incident. And in September 1931, there was some vandalism on the Manchurian Railway. The Japanese claimed that they saw a couple of Chinese people, planting dynamite along the railroad tracks, blew it up, and they ran away helter skelter. And then the Japanese claimed that the Chinese did it. And so, very conveniently, the Japanese had the Kwantung Army with a whole bunch of a huge army, situated right next to Manchuria, and they said, "Oops, there was a vandalism. We're gonna go in there and look for them, and we're gonna take over just to make sure everything's safe." So they invaded Manchuria to set up an independent Japanese-controlled state called Manchukuo, under the former emperor of China, Henry Puyi. Like I said before, the previous dynasty was a Manchurian dynasty, so Henry Puyi kind of grants it they were hoping that Henry Puyi, and that putting him as an emperor, would grant them some form of legitimacy over ruling Manchukuo. And Manchukuo, I guess, would be in Korea would be called Manjuguk, right? And of course, the Chinese were not happy with this, and they appealed to the League of Nations. And so if you look at the map at that time, it's pretty much Tokyo from Japan to Korea and entering Manchuria, and they renamed it Manchukuo. Manchuria, once again, is rich on coal and iron, and it produced almost half of the world's supply of soybeans at that time. So Korea for rice, and what else is better to go with rice and soybeans, right? Okay, not funny. So here are some pictures. Here you have a Japanese rail officials and reporters at the site of the alleged sabotage near Mukden. And if you look on that circle on the bottom left-hand corner, that's where the sabotage was. And so you could pretty much see it's kind of ridiculous because that little explosion really didn't do much. Here's another railroad sabotage site. And you see those Chinese words on the right hand side. That's also indicating the. It says iron road, so the railroad, and a fragment of the railroad being blown off. And so that was a little fragment that it's pointing to there. And so the Japanese troops gather outside of Mukden. And they start storming into Manchuria, and they march into Mukden on September the 18th. And so, like I said earlier, the Chinese appealed to the League of Nations. They weren't happy with the takeover. And so the League of Nations, in December 1931, appointed a commission led by Lord Lytton to investigate the whole situation. However, he did not go to Manchuria until April 1932 and did not make a report until October. And so that would pretty much mean he was appointed on December 1931, and he didn't go until 1932 of April. So that took him 5 months to go there, and he did not give a report until October, almost 10 months after the initial appointment of investigation. On October 1932, the lieutenant's report stated that Japan was the aggressor and should leave. And on February 24th, 1933, the assembly voted that Japan should leave Manchuria. Japan walks out of that meeting. So they just get up and walk out. Japan then continues, and they stay in Manchuria. The League could not, and the League fails because they could not agree on economic sanctions or an arms sales ban, because at that time, everyone at that time was hurting from the Great Depression. The last thing you want to do is to have a trade embargo on a modernized and economically sound nation such as Japan. And so no one wanted to have economic sanctions or an arms sales ban on Japan. And so Japan, there's really nothing that the League of Nations could use to enforce their verdict on Japan. Remember, once again, the League of Nations, the whole idea behind them is there's three ways to impose their verdict. Number one is moral persuasion. Number two is economic sanctions. Number three is military action. The first two failed, and they're not going to attack Japan. And so, essentially, they had nothing on Japan. In 1933, Japan resigned from the League of Nations and invaded Jeho, which is a territory right next to Manchuria. And basically, in 1937, they attacked China. And with the attack of China, they basically break the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Nine-Power Treaty signed at the Washington Naval Conference in 1922, which all of the signatories were bound to respect the integrity of China. And so, with the invasion of China, Japan breaks the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Nine-Power Treaty. The League of Nations, through this, was discredited. They were seen as, and there were a couple of things that the Manchurian Crisis showed about the League. Number one, it was slow. The Lenton report took a whole year, and Manchuria turned into Manchu Kuo by that time. And the other thing is, it was ineffective, since a country could get its own way as long as they ignored the League of Nations. The third thing is collective security failed against strong countries. You can have the whole idea of the collective security against a small country, but can you really protect and ensure collective security against a strong country? And because, especially during the Great Depression, where Britain and France was reluctant to put further economic strain upon themselves, either economically or militarily, by taking action against Japan, there's really no way to enforce anything. And at this time, it would be really useful if a big and strong country, such as America, would be part of the League of Nations, but of course they weren't. It also showed that there was a lot of disunity within the League of Nations. Even the great powers of the League even a lot of great powers within the League were happy to ignore it. And the USA, even though they were not part of the League of Nations, they also refused to put sanctions upon Japan to stop it. And also, Japan was seen as an ally against communism that was expanding in China, and leaving it alone was okay. And so, there was a lot of reasons why people were not were okay with Japan taking over China, but this also greatly discredited the League of Nations. So next, we're going to be looking at a couple of political cartoons. At the beginning of each of them, I want to just show the political cartoon, and then I want you guys to pause the video, and I want you to look at the video, look at the video and see the political cartoon, and I want you guys to do a couple of denotations and connotations on it. So once again, a denotation is what you see. A connotation is you write down what it means. make a T chart for it and have one side denotation, the other side connotation. And for each of these political cartoons, you could probably have at least 5 denotations and connotations for them. So these are pretty obvious ones. And all right, so let's do that. So for each political cartoon, we're going to stop for 4 minutes, and I want you guys to do denotations and connotations. And at the end, for the video, and at the end, once you guys unpause it, I'll be giving an explanation for it. Okay? So get ready to pause the video. Here's the first cartoon. So, according to this cartoon, it's a couple of things. Number one, you see a bunch of battleships in the background, and of course, on the top of these battleships, you see pagoda-like things, and that's a sign of Japanese militarism. You see a shell being fired from a Japanese gun, which shows the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and it blasts a hole through a bunch of papers. And with titles such as the League of Nations Covenant, which is the collective security, it blasts a hole in World Court, it blasts a hole in Kellogg-Briand Pact, it blasts a hole in the Nine Power Treaty, it blasts a hole in a bunch of stuff. And it pretty much it says that the invasion has rendered meaningless all the treaties that the countries of the world have made a promising peace towards. And so the message in the cartoon overall is that Japan is prepared to portray its treaty promises and the Covenant of the League of Nations and all in the hopes of collective security is meaningless as such, and war is pretty much on its way. As you see this on the bottom right hand corner, you see that officer holding onto a bullet, and of course on the bottom left hand corner you see a bunch of dead Chinese, or you assume they're Chinese. Okay, next cartoon, pause, discuss for 4 minutes. And so, in this cartoon, you see people fighting in the back. You see the League of Nations on the left-hand side, and you see a bunch of people pointing fingers and talking, but really they have no guns, they have no weapons, they have nothing, and they're just pointing. On the right-hand side, of course, you see Uncle Sam, which stands for the US of A, and Uncle Sam is, of course, standing there and not very happy as well. In the back, you see China and you see Japan duking it out and fighting. And China is represented with a Q, and Japan is represented in a more modern outfit. And pretty much they're fighting. And of course, Uncle Sam is standing opposite from the League of Nations because he wasn't really. He's really not part of the League of Nations, and America at that time was an ally of China with the nationalist government in China, and so America really was on the side of China. But of course, he could not. Uncle Sam could not participate in stopping the conflict as well due to the Great Depression, which was a limitation that every nation in the League of Nations had. And so the next one, once again, pause for 4 minutes, and we'll begin again. Alright, so for this video, this political cartoon, you see a Japanese soldier trampling on a beautiful woman and a document, which is, at the document, it's called Honneur de Nation, which pretty much says the honor of the nations, and also trampling on the League of Nations, which is that beautiful lady with her, lying flat on the ground. And you also see a league official bow before him and give him flowers, which is pretty much saying that the league is letting Japan get away with their aggression. You see the British Foreign Secretary called John Simon, and of course you don't know who's John Simon, but at that time that was how they drew him. You see John Simon powdering the league's nose with a face-saving kit, which is pretty much saying that Britain is not doing anything meaningful, but just trying to save face. You see Geneva there because Geneva is where the League of Nations is held. And the message in the cartoon is pretty much saying that the League has been humiliated by allowing Japan to invade Manchuria in defiance of the Covenant of the League. The cartoonist does not blame the League, but the weak and servile leaders who did not stand up to aggression. And so that's the general impression of, that's the general meaning of this cartoon as well. And this one is quite a popular one. And of course, you see the name doormat at the bottom. So, what happened after Japan took over Manchuria? Well, a couple of things. In 1931, they took advantage of an explode. So, like I said, sorry, this is pretty much a timeline. So, I'll just wrap it up, summary of what happens. 1931, Japan takes advantage of an explosion in the South Manchurian Railway to conquer Manchuria, set up a puppet government called Manchu Kuo, run by the former Emperor of China. 1933, the official League of Nations went ordered to leave Manchuria, and they decided to occupy Jehol in China. 1936, they formed an anti-Comintern pact with Germany, which is pretty much saying an anti-communist agreement with Germany. 1937, they invade China. In 1937, they also formed the Axis with Germany and Italy, which was called the Rome-Berlin Axis at first, since the whole idea was Germany and Italy wanted Europe to revolve around them, and that's why it's like kind of like the Axis. And of course, if Japan joins, they form the Axis. They join the Axis powers as well, and that's why you have the board game called Axis and Allies. But that's besides the point. 1941, Japan invades Indochina, and with the increased pressure on the Philippines and the whole gasoline problems that Japan was facing, that leads to the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the December of 1941. So here are a couple of conclusions on why the League of Nations was unable to stop Japan from taking over Manchuria in the 1930s. Mainly, you can break it down to 7 reasons. Weak powers. America was not a member, and therefore there was really no way to strengthen it or enforce it, since Britain and France had their hands tied up, particularly with Italy at that time, but we'll talk about that next lesson. The League structure and organization was inefficient. The World Depression made the nations less cooperative. The more the League failed, the less authority it had, and the League failed in a couple of cases earlier on, as we looked in earlier in Vilna and Corfu. Its own members betrayed it and let it down, and even at the leadership level. And the League faced aggressive military fascist powers at that time as well. So, how many of these factors can you see at work in the League of Nations failure in a Manchurian crisis, and where do you see it? And taking these ideas into account, why did the League fail in Manchuria? So right now, for just kind of to wrap up this lecture, I want you to answer the 2 questions at the bottom, just probably in a paragraph for each. And also check your emails for a PDF assignment that I'm going to send you, a very short assignment. And also you need to do the textbook sections in the Paper 1 textbook for the Manchurian Crisis. Next class, we're going to look at the Abyssinian Crisis. Okay?